a whole chapter, 30 verses. We're going to read them all. And I'd love for you to, as I tell my students, I'm a full-time teacher and coach and work here at the church part-time. And so thank you so much, Pastor Eric. We do need those prayers. We started professional development last week. It's incredible, the needs of our students, families, teachers. And in fact, I leaned over to Eric after he had prayed for teachers this morning. And I said, you know, if other than my parents, if it wasn't for teachers, coaches, and pastors, I don't know what route I would have taken as a young man. God placed teachers, coaches, and pastors, some of them in this room right now, in my life to show me the right choices to make, and more importantly, the godly choices to make. We need to pray for them. So thank you, Pastor Eric, for saying that. But we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3. And we are concluding the series, as Pastor Eric had already said, the gospel in the Old Testament. And so what you need to know as we get ready to dive into Daniel chapter 3 is that the word gospel, which you may or may not have already heard this past several weeks, the word gospel basically or literally means good news. It occurs 93 times exclusively in the New Testament, and the gospel is the whole of Scripture. More narrowly, it is the good news about Christ and the way of salvation. And the story that we are going to read this morning is an excellent story. It is a perfect picture of what happens when we face the unknown in life and the good news of God's Word comes and enters into that moment. You with me? This is a good story. It is good news, and therefore it qualifies as the gospel in the Old Testament. And so this is going to be a familiar story for many of you. In fact, many of you in this room have taught this story, but I'm going to ask politely, I'm going to ask that even though it's familiar, right? Even though it's familiar, that you are still fascinated by the story, that you are still fascinated by the message, and that you are still fascinated by what God does with these 3 Hebrew teenagers in the fiery furnace. So you with me? You got your phones, you got your iPads, you got your Bibles, whatever you need, and we're gonna make sure we look very closely at this. So before I jump into that, I want to tell you a quick story to help you with this. So what I need you to do, don't stand, but what I need you to do is I need you to raise your right hand, all right? So you don't have to raise it high, and I need you to repeat after me. I promise not to ever repeat the story that Tommy's about to tell. Now, your hands are up. Your hands are up. I don't know what that means, right? But when I was 19 years old, I was a freshman in college. I'd been there about maybe 6 weeks. And I was at East Texas Baptist University, Marshall, Texas. Some of you know where that is. And I found myself as a 19-year-old in the city of Marshall jail. Yep, my parents were very proud of me. Went off to college and got thrown in jail. But here's how it happened. I was sitting down in the basement of the dorm at the time. It was the only TV in the freshman dorm. I didn't have a TV or anything in my dorm room. And I was watching SportsCenter, right? Doing what a lot of 19-year-old guys would do. And these 2 guys, I played baseball there at ETBU, and these 2 guys come walking in, and I recognized them as fellow baseball players. I didn't know them real well because I was a freshman, but I recognized their face. And they walk in, and one is carrying a stack of milk crates, about 3 milk crates. You know what I'm talking about, the plastic, heavy-duty milk crates? What I'd already noticed in the first week or 2 of school, that almost all the dorm rooms had these milk crates, and they would use them for shelves, they would use them to stack their bed up, they would use them to do all kinds of fun things. I did not have any milk crates. If I'd called my mom and told her I wanted milk crates, she would have brought 1,000,000 milk crates. She's here this morning, nodding her head. But these two guys came in with milk crates. And I hollered out, I said, "Where'd y'all get those milk crates?" And as they passed by me real quick and went up the stairs to their room from the basement of the dorm room. They said, oh, they're giving them away at Brookshire's. And they walked up the stairs. Well, when they came back down the stairs, I said, were you guys going back for more? And as they moved towards the door, they said, yeah, we're going to go get some more. I said, well, I have a truck. And they stopped and turned around and said, you have a truck? I said, yeah, I have a truck. I said, well, come on. So I go out, I get in my truck, I'll follow them down as we're moving towards Brookshire's. We don't pull to the front of the store, we pull to the back of the store. We pull up to the dark area of the store. There on the, loading dock is stacks of milk crates. I don't know why. And they motioned me, pull up your truck right here. And I pulled up my truck. They hop up on the loading dock, and they start just throwing milk crates in the back of my truck. I get out of the truck, and I start helping organize them in the back of the truck. And about that time, 2 police cars come around the corner. I don't know. It was a Barney Fife moment in a small town in Marshall, Texas. But they don't just come around the corner. They come around the corner one side on this side. They got us boxed in. Right? They flip their sirens on. Big floodlights come on. I'm standing there in my truck looking at the spotlights. 2 guys up there on the loading docks. Right? They use their, guys, we need you to put your hands up. Move away from the milk crates. Move away from the milk crates. And they put us up against the wall there, put 2 police cars with their bumpers right at our knees. And I looked at the guy on the left, and I looked at the guy on the right, and I said, I thought you guys said they were giving these away for free. And they were like, well, not really free. I was like, we were stealing milk crates? And they were like, where are you from? They put us in handcuffs, put us in the back seat of the police car. And I remember as we were moving away, there was a manager. He had a big old name tag on his thing. A manager with his hands on his hip, watching as they pulled us away from the Brookshire's, just shaking his head. Take us down, put us through the thumbprints, and put us in a jail cell. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, the dorm mom, who I'd only met once at orientation, walks into our jail cell and says, guys, they're not going to press charges. But you guys are going to see the dean of students first thing in the morning. And we all, did that. It's probably the only time I ever did the jail cell walk, Here we go. Went back home. I couldn't sleep that night. Next morning, went to the dean of students. That's another story. But I had to call. They said, you need to call your mom or dad. So I call, and I'm thinking, my dad is going to go crazy. This is not going to go well. My mom, she's, nurturing and caring. She'll understand. And so my dad gets on the phone. He's like, well, son, sometimes you make mistakes, and you got to pay the consequences. I'm like, yes, sir. I'm thinking, whew, got away with that one. Then my mom gets on the phone. What in the world were you thinking? You have ruined the family name. No, not really. But it was one of those moments where I cried out to God. I prayed to God. I was like, God, if you'll get me out of this moment, I promise I'll never follow 2 people I'd never known before in the middle of the night to the back of a Brookshire store and steal milk crates. Anybody been there before? God, if you get me out of this one, I promise I will change my ways. Well, we're going to read a story today about 3 teenagers who found themselves in front of an authority figure. Except their response is not going to be, God, get me out of this. Their response is going to be, we're not going to bow down. And we're not going to give in. And we're not going to give up. And God is going to rescue us from this unknown moment. But even if He doesn't, even if not, we will stay faithful to Him. So let's go. Verse 1, you ready? King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And this is what I'm going to do through this whole sermon this morning. You ready? Did you know that the tallest statue in America is Statue of Liberty at 151 feet? Second is the Pegasus and Dragon in Florida. So the Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue of 90 feet, if it existed today, would be the 3rd largest statue in America. It would be the third largest statue, right? And it would be the only one made of gold, or at least gold-plated. So that's a pretty cool idea just to think about. Verse 2, King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. Then they stood before the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. What's the point of the author of Daniel telling us this? It's to let you know that Nebuchadnezzar made it very clear that once this statue was up, that every political official, every government employee, everybody who had any type of leadership in this empire was going to bow down to this statue. Even the Jews who were in exile, even these 3 Hebrew teenagers that were there really not by their choice. So let's keep reading. Verse 4. A herald loudly proclaimed, people of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. I wrote down here, the command was backed up with a powerful threat. Nebuchadnezzar regarded the refusal to worship the image as treason, not just a religious offense. In fact, we have what's called a cuneiform that still exists today in a museum. Now, cuneiform is a logo stylistic script on a kind of a rock tablet. And we have this in our museums today. And here's what it says about Nebuchadnezzar, right? Dating back to that time period. It says that Nebuchadnezzar was devoted to justice to the point that he, quote, did not rest day or night. One of the documents tells the story of a criminal who was guilty of a second offense. Nebuchadnezzar had him decapitated, afterwards had a stone image made of his head, and then displayed it in the city square as a warning. My point, when Nebuchadnezzar gave a threat and a warning, he was serious. This wasn't just something that he said about throwing people into a fiery furnace that may or may not happen. It was something that had already happened, and he was prepared to carry it out and do it. These Hebrew teenagers, these 3 followers of Yahweh, these 3 young men who were committed to God and not to bow down, understood what could possibly take place. Verse 7, therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and every kind of music, people of every nation and language fell down and worshiped the gold statue of that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. Chaldeans don't like the Jews, by the way. They said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews who have been appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, king. They did not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up. Now, the Chaldeans were known as famous astronomers and astrologers. These particular Chaldeans obviously had a political motivation against the Jews who had been promoted to a high political office. This was a reaction to Jews being elevated in the Babylonian kingdom. And what you see here is they're stabbing them in the back. And what we see here, these 3 Hebrew men must have known that eventually they would be discovered, yet they still obeyed God rather than men. By the way, did you know that there is over 500,000 Chaldeans that are citizens of the United States and still live here today in multiple states? The Chaldeans still exist. So verse 13, then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true? Is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Verse 15, now if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the drum, and every kind of music, fall down. Fall down and worship the statue that I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who could rescue you from my power? Wow, we could camp out and build a latrine and hang out just on that one verse for a while. Who are you? Who are you to challenge me? Because there is no God that can stand up against me as king of my kingdom. Here's what we need to know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Everything in front of them, the king, the furnace, the music, their compatriots, their competitors, all of it conspired to convince them to compromise. Yet God was more real to them than any of those things. You with me? God was more real to them than the king threatening them, than the fiery furnace next to them. God was more real to them than the music that was playing, leading them to bow down. God was more real to them than the 90-foot gold statue. God was more real to them than anything that any human could ever place in front of them. In fact, we know for sure that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were very aware of what was happening in that kingdom and the threat it made against their life. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. Key verse, verse 18. You ready? But if not, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you set up. I've entitled this sermon, But If Not, Walking In to the Unknown in Faith. Here's what I'd like to share with you about this particular verse. In the NIV, the CSB, and the NAS, it says, but even if God does not keep us from burning in the fire. Common English version says, but even he doesn't know this for certain. English Standard says, but if not, let it be known to you. The Living Bible said, but if he doesn't, please understand. In the King James Version says, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king. In other words, all these different translations say that the key words that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego give is that you can threaten us all you want, king, and you can ask us to bow down to this idol, king, but we believe that God can rescue us from your threats. But if not, if we do die in the furnace, know this, king, that we will not bow down, and we will not give in. We will trust God in the unknown, when the future is uncertain, when I don't have all the answers, when I am faced with scary moments in life. I will trust God, but even if my prayer is not answered, God is still in charge. Look at verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression of his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of the blazing fire. So these men in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and threw them into the furnace. Verse 23, and these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell, bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, didn't we throw three men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied. He exclaimed, look, I see four men not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like the son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called out, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you're servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. And when the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads were singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. And Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The Enduring Word Commentary that I was using as one of my sources says this. It says, there is a furnace that man prepares for himself, meaning that sometimes we, in our own mistakes, make the fiery furnace that we have to walk through. It says there is a furnace that Satan prepares, meaning that Satan will prepare moments in life in which we are tested and tried and we face difficult times. And then it says there is the furnace that God prepares. And God can deliver us from them all. He can miraculously sustain and strengthen us through any fiery furnace that life may place in our path. Verse 29. Therefore I issue a decree that any one of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So here we go. Ready? Walking into the unknown with faith. We get that, don't we? Can we kind of agree on that? The unknown is scary, right? You're waiting for test results. You're waiting for a diagnosis. You're waiting for something, a job insecurity. You're waiting for maybe a relationship that's on the facing difficulty. You're waiting for whatever may be coming, whether it's finances or a child's illness. But we've all been at that place, haven't we, where we have cried out to God and said, God, I need you to rescue me. I need you to answer this prayer. I need you to work a miracle in my life. We've been at that place where the unknown out there was extremely scary. And so here's how I want to help you with this. The first thing is this. Walking into the unknown with faith does not mean I stop trusting God to answer my prayer. I want to encourage you with that. That sometimes when we cry out to God and we ask Him to answer a prayer and it may or may not be answered, that does not mean that you are not trusting God. And so walking into the unknown, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't know if God was going to save them from the fiery furnace. They didn't know for sure that God was going to rescue them from Nebuchadnezzar's threats. But that didn't mean that they lost trust in God. The second one is this. Walking into the known with faith does not mean I stop praying for God to give me the desires of His heart. Now that's a key moment right there. Psalm 37 says, do not be agitated by evildoers. Do not envy those who do wrong, for they wither quickly like grass and wilt with tender green plants. Trust instead in the Lord and do what is good. Dwell in the land, live securely. Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you your heart's desires. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him, and He will act, making your righteousness shine like the dawn, your justice like the noonday. Walking into the unknown with faith does not mean that you stop praying for God to give you the desires of His heart. And the third one is this. Walking into the unknown with faith does mean that I will rely completely on God if I face a but if not moment. Remember verse 18? The king says, I'm giving you one last chance. If you'll just bow down, I won't throw you into the fiery furnace. You don't think Satan's going to come to you with that? You don't think that when you're in the middle of those trials and facing those unknowns, that the enemy's going to whisper into your ear, this is when you really find out if God is real? I personally have multiple friends that today, if you ask them if they're still trusting God, they would say no. And if you ask them why, they'll say, because God failed me when I asked him to give me this. That's a lie from Satan. Because those who are truly faithful and trusting God are at a moment in their life where they say, God, this is what I need. This is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm praying for. This is my request before you. But if not, Lord, if not, I will still trust you. Did Jesus not do that in the Garden of Gethsemane? Did he not kneel there in the garden and say to God, God, if you will, let this cup pass from me. If you will, if there's any other way for me to die for the sins or for me to be allowed to be a sacrifice for the sins of all mankind, if there's any other method that is available to you, God, can we not consider it? But then what did he say? But not my will, Lord. But not my will, but yours be done. So, this is exactly what we see from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They walked into the unknown with faith, crying out to God, making sure that God heard their requests, but understanding completely that trusting God is not based upon getting what we want. Don't miss this part. But it's trusting God, knowing that because he knows all things, and he knows us intimately as his children, that whatever the outcome may be, it is his will. It is his plan. So here's a couple of final thoughts. Fact. God already knew and always knows whatever unknown has come or is coming your way. I really want you to get that. God already knew that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were going to face the fiery furnace. And God already knows whatever unknown that you are facing. He already knows it. Even if you are not aware of it yet, he knows whatever unknown is coming your way. Number two, Satan will sow doubt in your mind and heart to isolate you during your battle with the unknown. What Satan wants is to remove you from those who would encourage you in your faith. Satan wants to isolate you so that you begin to doubt God. Satan wants to put you in a place to where fear, guilt, anger, bitterness grows in your heart. This is the enemy's tactic. I don't see it in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't see isolation. What I see is rest. They are resting in the fact that even faced with the king's threats, "O king, I hear your threats, but I am resting in the fact that God can, and if he chooses, will rescue us. But if not, just know, we ain't bowing down," as we would say in Texas. We ain't bowing down. Build your statues. Make your threats. We ain't bowing down. Fact, trusting God when battling an unknown strengthens your faith and others' faith around you. God will use your unknown and your faithfulness in the unknown to strengthen. Look what it did to Nebuchadnezzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's faith caused Nebuchadnezzar, right, to say, from now on, we're all going to worship that God. I mean, he's obviously, Pastor Eric, he's obviously a reactionary leader, right? We read about that in books. But I'm okay with that because his reaction leads to others knowing about God. And the last one, not being delivered from the worst unknown outcome is not a failure on yours or God's part. Let me help you with that. Just because God doesn't answer your prayers when facing the unknown does not mean that you have failed. And it does not mean that God has failed. And so I want to close with this last little illustration. I had a kidney transplant in 2014, was born with polycystic kidney disease, adult onset disease, and just like they had predicted, around 44, my kidneys began to fail, and I went on dialysis. I was on dialysis. I was what they call peritoneal dialysis, 9 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was a machine in my bedroom, a catheter in my abdomen. My wife, we would close the vents in the house, make sure no animals were nearby, because I literally had an open wound on a considerate basis, in my abdomen. And she would plug me up to a machine every single day to keep me alive. Eventually, my sister, thank you to her, she volunteered to donate a kidney. That kidney came to where it was favorable for me. And in January 2014, I had a kidney transplant. So if we had a contest of who had the most kidneys in the room, I would win. I have 3. If you have more than 3, let me know. I'd like to talk about that. But the night before the transplant, I have to be honest with you. I had heard all the ways that the transplant could go wrong. I had heard from the doctors of how these different things, statistically speaking, could go awry. At that particular time, the dialysis that I was on was not working the way that they had hoped it would. I weighed 270 pounds, fluid around my heart. My knees looked like cantaloupes. At one point, we were in the emergency room. The doctor told me and my wife, if we can't get this turned around, he'll be dead in 2 weeks. And that night, before the transplant, I wrote a handwritten note. I truly believed Satan had come at a place where he was telling me some very dark things. And I wrote handwritten notes saying goodbye to my kids, my wife, other members of my family. And I remember telling God, because I couldn't sleep that night before the transplant, we had to be at the hospital really early. I remember laying there in the darkness about 3 or 4 in the morning with the machine still pumping, right? Still doing the dialysis. I remember telling God, if this is what needs to happen, right? If I just need to basically fall asleep on that operating table and that's the end of it and I don't wake up again, I need to know. I need to know that what I've been told as a child and a teenager and as an adult about you is true. Facing the unknown. Now, keep in mind, they're really good at transplants. It's incredible. I mean, the science. Basically, transplants are, more than science. They're an art today. I think I was one of like 14 people that day. They ran us through like cattle, brand us and keep us going. But when you're facing the unknown, when you're having to face that, you feel very alone. And the enemy has a really, really good way of whispering dark things into your mind. And you can find yourself really, really hopeless, especially with threats of things that are scary. And I will tell you that God very silently, but very, very peacefully said to me in that moment, he said, Tommy, I just need you to trust me. But God, it's scary. I know. But I need you to trust me. I was very fortunate. I was very blessed. But please know from what we learned today, and then we're done, is that if God had somehow allowed my life to end in January 9th of 2014, that would not mean that I failed. And it would not mean that God failed. It would mean that God's will was different than what I had asked for. We need to go into the unknown like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. walking in faith, trusting, resting, and knowing that no matter the outcome, God is going to get the victory. Amen? Would you stand with me and we'll pray? I think it's important that you know that if I did not have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ during that crisis, I could not have prayed that prayer and I could not have had that faith. If you don't personally know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, if you've not come to that place in your life where you have said to Jesus, I need you to save me from my sin. I admit that I'm a sinner. I admit that I need you to rescue me. I admit that you need to come into my life. If you are not at that point and haven't experienced that salvation moment, then a lot of things we talked about this morning, you'll not be able to accomplish. You with me? If you don't know Christ, if you're not certain that you know Christ, there are people up here that have had a personal experience with Christ, and they will be more than happy. In fact, they'll be thrilled to lead you to a place where you can know Christ this morning. If you know Christ, and you're facing the unknown right now, one of the worst things you could do is isolate yourself. One of the worst things you do is fight it on your own. You come forward this morning or catch them after the service, they would be thrilled to pray for you. And I'm looking around this room and I see lots of faces that I know, and I know their hearts. Please don't go through the unknown. Please don't walk through the unknown, even with faith, by yourself. Remember, the Christian life was never meant to be lived alone. Find others around you. Everybody needs a Shadrach or a Meshach and Abednego, don't we? Somebody around us to walk through these things together. So let's worship Him. Pastors will be up front to counsel with if you need it. Let's sing.